Okay, so in this video, I'll talk to you about all my setups between drums and electronics since 2011. I'll walk you through each setup so you can understand the pros and cons and why I move forward between each setup. If you don't play drums, this can also be interesting for you as the drums can be replaced by any instrument. It will always be a question of how to get improvisational freedom, control over the machines, and freeing of the limbs so you can sound full. So my first setup was in 2011. At that point, all I wanted to do was to add effects to drums and control them live. So I got a microphone, a loop pedal, and a delay. Microphone was the SM57, the loop pedal the Boss RC3, and the delay the Memory Man Deluxe by Electro Harmonics. This was useful to make noise and also some rhythmic stuff with the drums in the delay. But I felt very limited as to what I could do because I could never turn off the mic, so it was always on the snare. If other people played instruments with me, it would bleed into the mic and get into my textures, and I could only layer stuff. So soon after this, I added an AB pedal to my setup. The AB pedal went between the mic and the first pedal, so I could put on and off the signal from the mic. It was like an on-off switch. I moved the mic to the floor tom because I felt it was a more interesting place than the snare, and with the AB pedal loop delay out. And with this, I added a synthesizer called the microKORG. I used it mostly to make noise and add textures to the whole kit. So with this setup, I was able to do noise and delay stuff with the floor tom mic and more effects with the microKORG. After doing this for a while, people started asking me to sub for bass players in bands. So I would play drums and keys to replace the bass. And so this setup became only with the microKORG. So microKORG directly out, no effects. This allowed me to practice more melodic stuff and bass lines and some independence between the keys and the kit. So after doing that with people, I wanted to do more of my own music. And so I brought back the microphone, but this time both the mic and the synth was going into the looper delay reverb out. My reverb at that time was the Reverberator by Dr. Scientist. And so I could loop stuff with the mic, be it drum textures or in this case, melodica. And I could also loop the synth. So this allowed me to have some type of evolution in a song because I could start with a bass line, add chords, and free my hands for the drums. This was also a limitation because I could only stack sounds and not really do any different sections. The Boss RC3 can only layer sounds and I think remove the last one or cut them all off. A problem with this also, it was difficult to cut all the sounds at once with a drum hit. So this was okay for that time, but I didn't feel very comfortable or free to make nice compositions and music that evolved. So soon after this, I put the microphone back on the floor tom with small percussions. So That portion of the kit was really to make ambience and noise and add like sound effects. And on my left side, I had the synth. I had also put the delay pedal on my snare so that it was closer to effect with my right hand while playing the drums. So I could play around the kit and move the delay with my right hand, and my left hand was on the keys. To be able to free my left hand for the drums, the keys were always with the maximum sustain, which was also limiting because I could not really do melodic stuff, only big chords, and it was only one sound. I felt a bit limited in the evolution the song could have. So soon after this, I decided to try and get more independence and movement in the synth. And so I would practice doing chords with the middle fingers and a melody with the thumb. So I could have moving chords with like a repeated note with a rhythmic pattern. I had also added an octaver, which was the electroharmonic Pog 2. So with this one, you can add 2 octaves on top, 2 octaves on the bottom. This pedal was next to my delay on my snare, so easy access. And so I could do pads and double them on top and on bottom and have a bigger sound and have some type of evolution in a composition. At this point, I had also added a volume pedal before the reverb so that I could cut off my sound quickly while doing a drum hit. The pedal was next to my hi-hat. This was important because if you turn off your synth with the volume knob in a show and you don't know where to put it back to when you sound checked, then you'll mess up your gain for the person doing sound and you'll have problems for the rest of the set. So after this, I wanted to add more textures again. So I brought back the microphone, but this time it was a handheld microphone, like a harmonica microphone, like a bullet mic. A good mic for this is the Shure 520DX, I think. But what I had was an aesthetic mic, vintage mic, and it broke in this session. Having a handheld mic allows you to direct what source you want to go to the FX. So you can take the mic in your hand while playing drums with your left one, put it on the floor tom, have this go to the FX, or if you want, put it on the cymbal or even on your voice. And so there's more possibilities with a moving mic. On my left side, I had the synth and an overdrive pedal. In this, it was interesting for the textures you can produce, but again, limiting because there's only one synth, one harmonic sound, and you can't add more melodies or bass or stuff like that. And also, the setup is pretty limiting for the freeing of the limbs because if your hand is holding a mic and the other hand is on the keys, you can't play drums or if this one is on the drums and this one is on the keys, you can't affect the effects. And so there's this kind of struggle in this kind of setup. So after this, I started looking into foot MIDI controllers. You have the organ types. There's one by Boss, which is pretty big, but the most compact one is by Keith McMillan. It's called the 12-step. So this one I would put next to my hi-hat, which allowed me to play bass notes while having both hands on the drums. And in this controller, you can also program chords. And so I could play chords using the sounds of my Mofo X4 at the time with my feet. This liberated both hands, but now you get stuck in having to do programmed chords. And this was again going into Octaver, delay, volume pedal, reverb, out. And at that time, I also had an SPDsx. And so I started using an electronic bass drum, which allowed me to use specific bass drum sounds for different songs. And it was more compact to carry in a cab or a bus, things like that. I used to carry my drums on a cart to go to the shows to save on a taxi fare. So from that setup, I thought it was limiting because the synth had 4 voice polyphony. So if your foot is using one, there's only 3 left for your hand, and it's all the same sound. So the filter affects everything the same. Everything is the same. And so I got a second synth, which was the Waldorf Blofeld. So second synth, another MIDI controller for my hand. Now both synths have their own effect line, which is Octaver, Bitch Crusher, delay, reverb, and I had also a freeze pedal so that I could freeze textures to again liberate my hands. And I was having difficulty with the stretch between the bass drum and the keyboard foot controller. And so I had added a double pedal so that when I was completely turned to the left, I could use the double pedal to hit the bass drum while being comfortable at the keys. I had also made a custom stand using Pearl ISS mount so that I could Velcro the Pog 2 on it so it would be easier to reach while I played. This setup was so big that it was not fun to carry around. It wasn't fun to set up. It was a lot of cables, patching, different size quarter jack so that I could place pedals at specific places. And while playing, it was so technical. It felt like a choreography. And I felt like it didn't leave me much space to make music and be free in the sounds. And so following this setup, I went completely the other direction and got an SPDsx. So now with the SPDsx, I didn't need that many pedals because I could work my sounds in the computer beforehand and load them into the SPD. This also allowed me to have an electronic kick, which was the Yamaha one at that time, and it became the KD7 by Roland after that. I still had the double pedal so that when I was at the synth station, I could play the bass drum. And I put my crash a bit closer so that it would be easier to play with my hand. And at that point, I wasn't using the Mofo X4 anymore. It was only a MIDI controller for the Blofeld, because within the Blofeld, you can split different sounds through the keyboard and add layers. So I had the modulation wheel adding layers to the Blofeld. I had Keith McMillan 12-step in a certain range of the Blofeld, so it would be a specific sound, and had programmed other sounds on different parts of the keyboard. And the Blofeld also has integrated effects like reverb, which sounded okay. So I didn't need any pedals anymore. So this was very compact, easy to carry. I could walk to shows. And I thought I was going in the right direction when I started using the samples. So following this setup, I was still having problems with the stretch between bass drum and the foot controller. And so I decided to remove the hi-hat. I thought that it wasn't that important in my music, and that removing this would allow me to put the controller closer to the normal spot for my foot. And so everything would become one instrument again instead of having two stations, drums and synths. So it was the same setup, SPDsx, electronic kick, snare, cymbal in the center with the Keith McMillan pads and the Blofeld. And now I had a 49 key M-Audio MIDI controller instead of the Morpho X4. It was much less heavy and also less fragile and more keys, so I could map the Blofeld to different parts on it and have even more sounds. This setup was feeling good for me, but still a bit spread out, so I moved back the SPDsx in the center over the snare a bit and put the cymbal back here, so now I could sometimes even hit the cymbal and a pad at the same time. Because one problem I had with the SPDsx is that if you want a sound to start on the first beat, you can't do a crash at the same time. So one thing I would do, but was a bit difficult, was to like swish and hit the cymbal and a specific pad at the same time, so I could do crash, kick, pad, and a chord at the same time. So this felt like a really good setup, and I thought I had finally found the end. But then I did a show, and I remember hitting a pad, which was like a big noise in which I was supposed to do a drum solo. And the pad's volume was so low that it felt awkward to play the drums. And it made me realize that I shouldn't leave the sound balance to the person doing the sound. I should give them simply a left-right with all my sounds volume pre-made by me into it. And also because some of the venues I was playing at didn't have enough DIs. Often they don't want to share DIs between the different bands, and they don't have like 10 DIs for everybody that has a synth, a stereo, a SPDsx, and a stereo effect pedals. So I got a mixer. And in this mixer, I plugged the SPDsx left-right and the synth left-right. So now I can have all my sounds in stereo. And I would just simply send the output to the sound person. And this also allowed me to monitor myself through the mixer. So for venues who didn't have enough monitors or with bad sound, I could hear myself perfectly. after having this setup for a while, I realized that my music was more based around synth textures and ambience. And so I tried to center that on my setup instead of placing it like a drum kit with synths. So I moved the SPDsx to the center, put the snare on the side with the cymbals. So the drums became a section on the right. And now I had place in the center for the SPDsx. It was easier to reach the pedals, which were velcroed on my keyboard next to the synth. And now I had a sustain pedal next to the foot controller, which allowed me to do chords, hit sustain, and now both hands are free for the drums. This also went into a mixer, into Octaver and Reverb. Having the Blofeld as a desktop synth made me realize that this was the best option for me because you can use any synth with any controller. So for smaller gigs, if you're accompanying people, you don't need to bring your 49 note. You can bring a 21 note and choose any synth you want, and you have more combinations possible. So I got a second synth, which at that point was the GU06, like the Juno copy, next to the Blofeld. And so now I could have my foot controller on a specific synth, the hand MIDI controller on another specific synth. And after doing a few shows, I had realized that my performance is not very visual because I'm doing a lot of things at the same time and it takes all my attention, and so I'm not very demonstrative. And because you're the only one on stage, people don't have other people to look at. So I was trying to get into controlling my visuals as I play. So I got the ETC pedal by Creator and Guitari, which can link via MIDI to your synth, and it will move the graphics while you play. So now I had one synth controlling the visuals into a projector onto me. So this was an okay setup, but I felt limited visually pretty quick because the pedal was fun if you have both hands on it. And I never had enough hands to do both synths, effects, and the drums at the same time and control a video pedal. And at that same time, I wanted to buy the OP1. So I sold that pedal and got the OP1. The OP1 really helped me out because it was my first time with mini keys. And mini keys, if you're playing with only one hand, can allow you to have a much bigger range for chords or melodies, or if you want to play bass with your pinky finger and other stuff. And at that point, I had also sold the Blofeld and got Modular 32 by Moog. So now I had the OP1, Modular 32, into the reverb, which was Autobam, and into Eventide Pitch Factor. And in this setup, I also added a mixer with FX sends. Instead of having different lines of effects for each synth, I could put all my synths into the mixer and send them to the effects I wanted. So the Eventide Pitch Factor allowed me to make the Modular 32 mono synth into a polyphonic synth, because this pedal can harmonize and you can choose a tonality and it will do nice chords and spread it out. And with the OP1, I could now do arpeggiator stuff or random notes ambient with the tombola or sequence stuff. And all this into the mixer. I could send the signal to the FX briefly, and it was easier to control overall. And for the drum side, I had removed all cymbals and was trying to get a more percussion approach to it. So if my synths were all ambient, experimental texture stuff, I wanted the drums also to reflect that. So I tried to remove all the cymbals, and also because it was easy for me to always resort to bashing my crash to gain extra space to make things sound more full. And I felt that was a crutch. And so I wanted to try and develop more techniques of real playing versus doing long sounds with the ride to fill in the spots where I don't have two hands. So with this setup, I felt like the mixer was too big. It was the most heavy item in my case. It was bigger than both my synths and my pedals. And I was trying to find a smaller version of a mixer that had enough FX sends for me. I needed at least two. And so eventually I found modular synth mixers. And this made me take the leap and get into modular synth because of the compactness of it. Often I went to gigs walking or by bus to save money. So with the modular synth, it changed everything, because now I had three voices in the modular synth, which were controlled with the OP1. So I had the OP1 sending MIDI signals to the Hermod, and the Hermod splitting those signals between three voices, which was pluck, plats, and the Modular 32, which I still had. I could make it so it was random. So I could put an arpeggiator on the OP1 and have the notes of the other modules come out randomly. So with this, it made me able to go back into an improvising mindset, because I was not controlling everything. I was only controlling the chord colors, and the modules were doing things on their own. So it felt more like I was interacting with a machine or a person sending musical ideas while being able to control the chords and the modal colors. this time now my OP1 was going into the modular synth mixer, so I didn't need an external mixer. It made me lose my self-monitoring, but also at that time I was doing shows more in DIY venues and realized that it was more fun to play with the sound of the room rather than the sound in my ears, because it felt more like a jazz approach into electronic music. So with this setup, I started feeling like my sound was too dry, cold, and didn't really have personality, because every time I would record this kind of setup in my computer, I would always add tape plugins. And so I was trying to find a way to add this kind of tape glue or saturation at the end of my chain, even after the reverb. And it was very difficult to find a stereo tape pedal. The only one I found was the Strymon Deco. So I added the Strymon Deco at the end of my chain. And so in this setup, I had also added a sampler, which changed everything, because now I could use sounds that I had reamped into rooms or into pedals and bring them into my sound. So I felt like the sounds were more unique and more organic, which is where I was trying to go. And the sampler I had was the Qubit Nebulae, which is stereo, so I could do sounds that moved around in the stereo field to give the ambience for the listener, and play chords with the OP1 on top and have it through the Hermod control pluck and plates to add other notes to this, going into the reverb and going into the Strymon Deco. So this setup I liked a lot, and I liked it so much that I decided to add a second sampler. I bought a second Qubit Nebulae, so now I had two nebulae going for ambient stuff. I removed pluck, I kept plates, which was my only voice, and I had the OP1 doing arpeggiation and this type of stuff, into the reverb, into the tape saturation. So this was a very good setup, but the nebulae have a limit for the number of sounds you can put on them. And so to play a 40-minute set, I had to reduce each sample to about 7 to 10 seconds. And so I could not put long samples or longer sounds, and it was always sounds that were looped, not triggered. And so it was very ambient and random, which I liked for this, but I was starting to imagine to have more samples, and having 3 or 4 nebulae was pretty expensive and also uses up a lot of space in your modular synth. And at the same time that I was looking for this solution, Squarp Instruments invented Rample, which is a 4-voice sampler. And so this brings us to my current setup, which is my favorite so far. There's Rample, which is a 4-voice sampler. I use the 2 first voices as a stereo sample, and then the 2 other voices are either bass notes or chords. And Rample allows you to put 12 variations of notes. So I can put, like in the 2 first voices, I can put a very long stereo sound that I've made from tape loops and things like that, which will just run in infinity to give a big ambience. And then I can put up to 12 bass notes that will fit in that harmony, and put up to 12 chords that will fit in that harmony also. This is triggered by my bass drum. So now I have the Yamaha DT50 trigger on my bass drum that can trigger those sounds. And because I don't want the sounds to be triggered at every hit, I use a chance module, which is twigs, which is a dual branches bimutable instruments. So I have 4 inputs with 8 outputs, and you can change the degree of chance that the hit will go through. And so I have the bass drum sending trigger to this, which sends trigger to the samples. So they never fall at the same place. So while I'm playing, I feel like I'm improvising with somebody, but they will always happen on a kick. So they will always happen while I'm doing something. So it can feel more together instead of just being random. And I have the Zadar envelopes that are looping into the gain of these sounds, which is Scan and Pan. Scan and Pan is my main mixer. And so they will never be the same because the volume is always moving up and down. So even if it's triggered, it's not the same. And I have Oct modulating the pan, so the sounds can have a stereo image, the mono sounds. So all this makes me able to just put sound ingredients in my machines and have them be triggered randomly, but always happen while I'm doing something. Some things I might add, I'm trying to find a way to add more interaction or events for variation. And also I have to practice chaining songs, just having longer than one at a time to see how that goes. Alternate setups that you can use and that I've tried for drum specifically is the sensory percussion. This allows you to do anything. It's unlimited. You can program everything to everything. Your drum becomes a MIDI controller, or you can route it to hardware gear or into your DAW. Your drums will become melodic, harmonic, effects, everything. The reason I didn't stay with that setup was because I think that for the audience, it's a bit more difficult to understand what you're doing musically if every action is triggered by a drum hit. And so I prefer to have a visual keyboard next to me, but I might get back to it soon because I would like to experiment with mixing it into my system. So I hope this video helps you understand how I'm doing what I do and where I come from, and maybe help you find your own setup. I've just started making these types of videos where I explain the creative process in between making live sessions. And so if you would like to help support me, it's possible by purchasing my music on Bandcamp or listening to it on streaming platforms, or by subscribing to my Patreon. If you have any questions about anything, you can ask in the comments or in the community section of YouTube, or send me a private message. I'll respond to everybody and anybody. So that's it. Thank you. Bye.